right, well, let's bring in Paul Kelly, Editor-at-Large at the Australian newspaper now, joining us from the Sky News Centre. Paul, a very good morning to you. Let's just pick up on this debate around the temporary exclusion orders. There'll be a number of pieces of legislation when Parliament's back tomorrow, but this is going to be perhaps the more interesting one to watch. The government's not adopted all of the recommendations from the Joint Standing Committee that's gone through this process, but clearly most of them, and it's still a little unclear whether Labor will back it in the end. Do you think the government has made the case for these new laws?
David, there's no doubt at all that the government and Peter Dutton are going to run very hard on this foreign fighters bill with its temporary exclusion provisions. And the essence of this is that the minister can delay by 2 years the return of these foreign fighters to Australia. The purpose of that is to allow the agencies to assess them. The point I'd make about this is there's no doubt there is a genuine security issue here. Secondly, there's no doubt that when it comes to public opinion, it's very much on the side of action being taken. The debate, I think, will revolve around the detail. The debate will revolve around the terms and conditions under which the minister can exercise this power. And there have been differences between the recommendations of the Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security on the one hand and the government on the other. But I do note that the chair of that committee, the Liberal Andrew Hastie, has said that it is an operational imperative for this legislation to pass. So at the end of the day, this, I think, will be a test of the Labor Party and of the Parliament. Labor, I think, agrees in principle with action being taken, but Labor will have to look at the actual detail involved. In this sense, I think it will be a test of where Labor, under its new leader, Anthony Albanese, comes out when it comes to these national security issues, and also a test for the new Shadow Minister, Christina Keneally.
Yeah, it will be. I know she said she supports what the committee has recommended, but as you say, there are a few changes there. Whether they'll reach agreement on all of that, we'll see. The Indigenous voice to Parliament, Paul, it's been another interesting week of debate on this front, with the former High Court Chief Justice Murray Gleeson giving a fairly powerful speech in favour of the voice, pointing out it's nothing to be afraid of, that Parliament would ultimately decide how it's constructed, what it does, what authority it has and whether it needs to change. We've also seen Barnaby Joyce concede that he was wrong to call it a third chamber of Parliament, something Malcolm Turnbull and others picked up on that line. What do you think? Is there still a chance to have the voice to Parliament referred to in the Constitution once it has been properly explained and detailed and worked out, or do you think the horse is already bolted now?
Well, that's a critical question, David. Now, there's no doubt that Murray Gleeson's comments, he's a former Chief Justice appointed by John Howard, are significant. He said that the Parliament and the nation can benefit from having the voice to Parliament constitutionally enshrined. There's no doubt that his intervention will assist the proponents and the Indigenous leadership in campaigning for the voice to Parliament. The point I would make, however, is that to a certain extent this is all superfluous. There will not be a referendum put this term on a national voice to Parliament being constitutionally enshrined. The Prime Minister has made this absolutely clear, and the Prime Minister's views won't change on that question. There is very little support for the voice to Parliament being put into the Constitution within the Morrison government, and very little within the coalition parties. I think the further point to make about this is that Scott Morrison has drawn a distinction between the voice to Parliament on the one hand and constitutional recognition on the other. When it comes to the voice to Parliament, the debate will now focus on devising a legislative framework, very much with an emphasis on the local and the regional. When it comes to the government's position and the Prime Minister's position, I think there are a couple of points that do need to be made. If the voice is in the Constitution, it means the Parliament can't abolish the voice. So there are implications there for parliamentary supremacy. Secondly, when it comes to the debate about the third chamber. Clearly, it is not a third chamber. It can't be a third chamber. But as an advisory body, the entire purpose is to influence the first and second chambers. That is to influence the bills passed by the Senate and House of Representatives. And finally, and I think most importantly when it comes to the coalition parties, it is a representative race-based body being put into the Constitution. And the Conservative side of politics has, in principle, concerns about that, and it certainly believes the Australian public won't support it.
Paul, a final one. You've written this weekend about the future of liberal democracy amid some fears that it may not last in the United States. What's driving those fears?
Well, I interviewed Jonathan Haidt. He's the prominent American social psychologist who's now visiting this country. I think he's one of the most illuminating people to speak to about the plight of Western democracies. He's done path-breaking work about the crisis in the United States university system and in a broader sense about the dilemmas facing American democracy. And his argument goes really back to human nature. What he's saying is that human beings are tribal people, and the existence of liberal, tolerant, secular, multicultural democracy is not a natural, reoccurring occurrence, that it's much more fragile than we appreciate. He argues that the current conflict between conservatives and progressives in the United States is not just a political conflict, it's a moral conflict, and it's a moral conflict between competing cultures that don't seem to be able to speak to one another or understand one another anymore. And this problem is accentuated by the rise of social media that he argues is destroying any capacity for shared dialogue, shared meanings and shared understandings across the community. He says that he wouldn't be surprised if there's a failure of American democracy in the next 30 years, and he thinks the next 10 years are going to be very bleak. I think his insights are certainly worth analysing and studying closely.